Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Mama Project podcast. I have a special guest for us today. I have Kathy O'Brien, and if you don't follow her on Instagram, you should because she has amazing content and super educational. She is the Mini Me dietitian on Instagram. So, Kathy, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, I tried to get her on here for like months, guys. So this is awesome. I'm so excited to have her. So Kathy and I went through a coaching program together, and I've loved seeing her, her content and everything evolve. But tell us a little bit about your background and, your bio and how you got to what you're doing today.
Yeah, so I am a registered dietitian. I've been a dietitian for almost 9 years, but I worked in a children's hospital for 6 of those years and specialized in pediatrics. So I am a pediatric dietitian by specialty or profession. But when I was working in the children's hospital, I really had an eye-opening experience and realized how much my heart for kids was actually in prevention instead of treatment. Working in the hospital, I just was seeing so many um, instances where little ones were struggling in either their relationship with food or a disease related to nutrition, or that could have been prevented by different approaches nutritionally. So really realized that I wanted to get on the prevention side instead of the treatment side, specifically nutritionally speaking. But then in 2021, I became a mom. I had my son, and I just realized how little guidance as a mom I got on the feeding journey with my son. I think I honestly expected the pediatrician to like hold my hand and walk me through it and tell me exactly what to do, and that just didn't happen. And I loved my pediatrician; she was great, but I quickly realized that that just wasn't her role to fill, and realized how many other parents on the feeding journey are just lost or lacking guidance. And so I started my Instagram page out of a desire to just help any other mom or parent who was starting the feeding journey with their little one, and maybe they could learn something from me. Just kind of a picture of our journey as we started solids, and then honestly really just evolved into realizing how much parents needed this help and this support. And so now I've built an entire coaching program around it. I get to help clients and coach them through starting solids all the way through toddlerhood, navigating picky eating, and I just absolutely love it.
So you work specifically with parents from like starting solids journey to about like 2 years old, right?
Yes, 6 months through 2 years.
6 months. Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
So we're gonna talk in this podcast today mostly about like toddler
Hmm.
eating and picky eating and things like that. But I really wanted to touch on that first year of life. So how important is that first year of like starting solids and like that 6 to 12 month and what that should look like?
Yeah. So something that I hear all the time is food under one is just for fun. And that is absolutely not the case, even though there is a lot of fun found in it. There's also a lot of nutritional importance in it. And so babies have super high energy needs, and also high iron needs. And after 6 months of age, their iron stores from in utero have been used up, and they are requiring additional energy to support their rapid growth and brain development. So, nutritionally, there's totally an important piece to starting solids. But the other thing is that there's a really key window of opportunity from 6 to 10 months where babies are the most willing to explore a variety of tastes, textures, like flavors, different foods. And so it's really important to capitalize on that, especially before we enter toddlerhood, when a lot of opinions and things start forming, and it can get a little bit harder to keep an open mind to a variety of different foods. Plus, starting or advancing at least from purees to solid foods, or even just starting on solid foods young, also helps to strengthen their oral motor skills and oral development. So there's so much benefit there. So definitely want to be starting at or around 6 months. It's not necessary before then, but we do want to start around that 6 month mark, and definitely not put it off until closer to one.
Absolutely. What would you say the biggest myths are that you hear or maybe you've seen on social media about the starting solids journey, like the 6 to 12 month range?
Myths, definitely the food under one is just for fun. That's a big one that I hear. Also that there's too much pressure to start, like just wait until they're older. It doesn't really matter. And I have seen the negative effects of waiting, or of prolonging it. So, definitely that. Also, just the idea that, they don't need to see a wide variety of foods, or like you only need to serve iron rich foods. And while those are really important, we also want to get a wide variety in front of them in that really key window of opportunity. So,
I think another thing, at least for me as a first time mom, and this is a lot of moms talk about this, is the
mhm.
fear of choking. I mean, I
Yes.
cannot even tell it. Like we did baby led weaning with my daughter, and I would give her a piece of asparagus or like a piece of
Hmm.
zucchini or whatever, and my parents are baby boomers, so they likely just did purees until we were one or whatnot. But
Hmm.
my daughter one time gagged, not choked, right? Like on a piece of
Hmm.
zucchini. And she like got it up. So what is one thing you can either say or teach parents that will kind of calm their fear and anxiety around choking and baby led weaning?
Yeah. So gagging is a completely normal part of the process. As scary as it is, it's actually protective against choking. So the gag reflex is there for them to exercise that gag and protect against choking. Because what gagging does is it tells them, oh, I need to get something out, right? So even though it's scary, there's a big difference between gagging and choking. So it's actually very protective. And as little ones get older, the gag reflex weakens, or it actually moves further back in their mouth. So when they're little babies, it's very frontal in their mouth. And then as they get older, it moves further back. So the gagging decreases. But there's actually, like, studies show that there is not an increased risk of choking between babies who are started on purees and babies who are started on solids. So baby-led weaning is actually not more of a choking risk than starting with purees are.
Okay. How does the feeding journey change in the second year of life? Like past
Oh,
12
drastically.
months? Yeah.
Yeah, if you've been there, you know it does
Yeah.
change. But really there is a physiological reason that it changes so much. And I think it takes a lot of parents by surprise. And it's just like a mad shock when you feel like, oh my gosh, my baby used to eat everything, and now we're in toddlerhood and you're not eating any of the same foods, and the things that you used to love, you're throwing on the ground now, and like just what's happening, right? And there are actually two things that happen around the age of one in a little one's body, that support that change happening. And so when, like I was mentioning, in the first year of life, energy demands are really high, right? So babies require a lot of energy to support their rapid growth and development. After the age of one, growth rate, like expected growth rate, drops drastically. And so, along with that, appetite follows suit. So it can feel like, oh, my baby who's eating everything under the sun. Like, I remember being shocked by how much my son could eat when he was like 10 months old. I was like, is he ever going to stop? And then the change definitely came. But so with that decrease in growth rate, appetite follows. And so you have a decreased appetite, plus you have a little one who is becoming way more aware of their surroundings. They're forming a lot more opinions, and learning how to like essentially manipulate situations. And so when you put those two things together, a lot of times you're set up to see big changes happen in their eating habits. And it's not always something that requires change. It's
Yeah.
just like, oh, that's happening.
Yeah. You talk a lot on your Instagram about the importance of avoiding added sugar before two. Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah. So there's two big reasons for this. So this is what the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends, is to avoid added sugar in the first 2 years of life. And the two reasons, again, going back to those high energy demands, a lot of this comes back to just like what do our babies' bodies need? So they have these high demands to support their rapid growth and brain development, and that requires really key and quality nutrients. And when little ones aren't really eating that much volume wise, there's really not room to like waste space. So when there are foods with a lot of added sugar in them, that take up space in their diet or their belly, essentially, it's just taking up space or displacing other nutrients that are more important for them. So that's one reason. The other reason is that in the first 2 years of life, we are really forming our little ones' taste preferences. And research does support that in the first 2 years, you're establishing their lifelong preferences. And so little ones who are exposed to super sweet tastes in that first 2 years of life are more likely to have a higher propensity towards sweet tasting foods later in life. And we do know that overconsumption of sugary foods throughout a lifespan can lead to poor health outcomes.
And we're talking more like cookies and cake and things like that and not fruit, right? Because we know like all kids love fruit.
Yes, definitely a difference between natural sugar and added sugar. So fruit by itself is not a food with added sugars in it. But the place to really pay attention, honestly, because especially if you are already being mindful of like, oh, well, I'm not giving my baby cookies or ice cream or things like that. But there are a lot of baby and toddler marketed foods and snack foods that still contain added sugar. So honestly, reading labels for added sugar is a really helpful thing to do. So if it's a fresh food like, oh, I just picked up a strawberry, zero worries. When it's something coming out of a package, we want to know what else is in there.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what about after two? I guess. Like, I mean, I know we're gonna stick to under two, but
Yeah.
how do you navigate? I know because yours is your son two, he's two or three?
He will actually be 3 next week.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
on Thanksgiving.
yeah, after two, what is the I guess recommendation in starting to introduce more sugary type foods or sweets or desserts?
Yeah. So something you'll glean from me if you follow me on Instagram is that although I am really big about helping parents follow nutritional recommendations for their little ones and specifically under the age of 2, I'm also a really big supporter of forming healthy relationships with food. Like I personally struggled with an eating disorder for many years. And so not having a mind of like restriction or labeling foods as good or bad, is really important to me. And so helping my son to form a healthy relationship with all foods, including sweets, is absolutely something that I am doing. Um, Guidelines wise, it's recommended after the age of 2 to limit to under 25 grams of added sugar a day. And that's based on a 10% of total energy intake. So if you want numbers,
Okay.
um, the way I implement that in real life is in day to day. I am mindful of like still snacks and foods that we buy and foods that I prepare, being mindful of limiting added sugars, because that's good for all of us. But then when there is an opportunity to like get ice cream with grandparents, or there's cake at a birthday party. I don't worry about it because I know what we're doing in the day in and day out is what matters most.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. What are some of the biggest struggles your clients are facing to feeding their toddlers?
Yeah, definitely getting them to try new foods,
Okay.
feeling stuck in ruts of like serving the same thing all the time, or they only want to eat certain things, so that's what I'm making on repeat. So struggling with coming up with what to feed. And definitely mealtime battles, just like how do I handle different behaviors, food throwing, trying to get them to eat anything, right? Um, and then also something that I work with my clients on is transitioning from a primarily milk-based diet to a primarily food-based diet. So that
Mm.
includes dropping bottles, transitioning away from milk feeds and being more dependent on solid foods. So,
Yeah. What are some of the things you want to avoid saying or doing at the table as a caregiver?
mm, um, that's
We could talk about this for another
yeah.
hour, probably. I guess
Yes.
just some of your favorites.
Yeah. So under the umbrella of not adding pressure, honestly, is where I live.
Yep.
So essentially anything that you're doing to try to get your child to eat out of your own words is most likely going to push them further away. So if it's like, this chicken is so good. Will you take a bite of chicken? I love chicken. You should take a bite of chicken. Even though that sounds positive, the way that you're saying it, that comes off to your child as pressure and oftentimes will backfire. A big one too is like bargaining or
Mm.
saying like if you eat a bite of your broccoli then I'll give you more strawberries, or like using certain foods for essentially reward or punishment. That's also going to work against you. So really anything that is, there's so many things, but
There's so many.
anything that could
Yeah.
give like underlying pressure. And honestly, something that so many of my clients realized when we worked together is I didn't even realize I was pressuring my child. Like there were things in our mealtime environment or things that I was saying that like I didn't even know I was doing until we really got into this, right? So
What was one of the, I was just gonna follow up with a question. I'll think of it probably. So what is picky eating exactly? And like why are so many toddlers deemed picky eaters?
I love this question. Because I have a love-hate relationship with the word
With
picky eating
yeah,
or
yeah, or just
picky.
picky in general, right?
Yeah, because honestly, I truly believe that so many little ones are just labeled as picky unfairly or too soon. But picky eating happens for many reasons, some of which are completely out of our control. Like there's even a genetic link to picky eating. But in toddlerhood specifically, there's so much changing within their body. And there's really, as much as we don't give them credit for this, they're really still just new to learning food. So they're still coming to know, like, and trust different foods. And so to us, that can feel like everything is hit or miss, when in reality, it's just a learning process. And they need us to be more consistent more than anything. So I can't tell you how many times I've had clients go through my coaching program thinking that they had a picky eater walking into it and coming out of it saying, "Oh, my kid's actually not picky. I just didn't know how to define everything that was going on and how to actually support them to be more adventurous with food."
Yeah, absolutely. Why are you so adamant about offering the family meal? You talk about that a lot also.
I do. Honestly, so you don't lose your sanity. Like, I don't know about you, but I don't want to make tons of separate meals every single day. Like as a mom, you have so many other things in your mental space. Like there's limited capacity up there. So like to become a short order cook essentially was just never something I wanted to do. Um, but also the family meal is typically where the most nutritious foods are being served, right? So if we're serving separate meals or making something different just because we think our little one might eat it, it might not be as nutritionally dense as what the family meal was that was being served, right? So that is also kind of a call to action to parents to really take a look at what they're eating and see and say, like, is the family meal actually the more nutritious, right? And if it's not, that's honestly a place that I would put some work, because really where the whole concept of like the mini me dietitian came from is because our little ones are learning from us and from our behaviors. And so we do want our diets, our meals, our habits to be reflective of what we want them to learn how to do. So,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
at just like face value or face level, if you want your someday older toddler or child to eat the family meal, without having like a hard adjustment period in transitioning from like this is kid food to this is adult food, then you just have to start early, right? Like a baby who eats the family meal from day one, it becomes a toddler who has known nothing different.
Absolutely. What I was going to say earlier was about the division of responsibility. So
Mm-hmm.
we kind of talked about that a little bit about the family meal, but what is the division of responsibility and how can parents utilize it in feeding their kids?
Yeah. So the division of responsibility is really where a lot of that like no pressure mindset comes from. But what it's a principle that was coined by Ellen Satter. And she it essentially defines the parent-child roles in the feeding relationship. And it states that it's the parent's job to choose what is served, when it's served, and how it's served. And it's the child's job to choose if, what, or how much to eat of it. So it essentially puts you in your own lane. And honestly, it's when those paths get crossed, or when you're operating in your little one's lane or they're operating in your lane, that things get really messy.
Absolutely. So, what is normal toddler eating behavior and how does that change throughout toddlerhood?
Erratic and unpredictable is essentially what it boils down to. So it can be very normal for appetites to ebb and flow, to fluctuate drastically from one day to the next, one week to the next. And it's also totally normal for them to eat like a couple good meals and snacks a day and then completely skip others, which I know can be terrifying. But that's really, it all ties back to the division of responsibility, honestly, in being able to trust our little ones' bodies, and honor their own hunger cues.
Yeah, absolutely. I was telling Kathy before we started recording that my daughter was the type to eat everything. Like 6 to 12 months,
Mm-hmm.
she was like, I was like, this is amazing, right? And then right around 15 months, it like was like a light switch and it changed. And she
Yeah.
hated avocado. And I'm like, in my head, I didn't say this to her, but I was like, she loves avocado. Like, why are you all of a sudden rejecting avocado?
Mm-hmm.
But I just kind of kept offering it along with other things. And 6 months later, she grabbed it and asked for more of it. And I was like, okay, like if I would have thought back then, oh, well, she doesn't like avocado anymore, I'm just never going to serve it. She's not going to eat it because I'm never going to serve it. So it's like exposure too, right? I mean,
Exactly.
talk about exposure because I think that that's one thing parents don't get is like they need so many exposures to this food to like accept it, right?
So many, and like so many more than you would think too. So it can take 15 to 20, sometimes more exposures to the same food to really determine a preference. And honestly, in the first 2 years, like, I don't know about you, but I don't have the mental capacity to keep track of how many times I've served a certain food. So like I'm not actually
Right.
tallying that. So in the first 2 years, my motto is like, if it's part of the family meal, your child should be seeing it too, whether you think they like it or not, because you never know when they could surprise you. And it's so funny, your story about avocado, because we went through the exact same thing. Like my son loved avocado as a baby, didn't eat it for 8 months straight, and then like all of a sudden ate a whole one day. And same thing, he would not have ever gotten there had he stopped seeing that food, right? So exposure is so key. And going back to even like my personal experience when I was working in the children's hospital, like I saw so many kids who, I'm not even kidding, didn't eat a single fruit or vegetable. And it 9 times out of 10 came back to like, well, they just stopped eating them as a toddler, so we stopped serving them. Right. And there's just that's so much opportunity that's lost. So yeah,
Yeah,
exposure is
absolutely.
huge. Repeated
Yeah.
exposure is huge.
Or just like, and just like, if I started being like, oh, you don't like avocado, and I started
Hmm.
telling her that, and I stopped,
Yes.
like, then it like reinforces that behavior,
Yeah.
right? Or like, oh, you don't like vegetables, or oh, you're picky. Like labeling your
Hmm.
child as picky too. So what are typical portions that should be served for a toddler? Because I love this because I love seeing your plates and stuff for your son because I'm like, yes, that's exactly like how, how I serve her food, like
Hmm.
smaller, kind of smaller portions, and then just like gives them the opportunity to ask for more. Because I feel like serving them a lot is usually overwhelming for them, right? So talk a little bit about portions for food for toddlers.
For sure. I get this question so much, like how much should my kid be eating or how much should I put on their plate? And to be completely honest, I'm so not focused on portions for little ones.
Mm-hmm.
There are much better indicators that a child is getting enough aside from measuring portions. And so like having that insight is very helpful. But I always err on the side of starting small, like you said, because a small portion of food is going to be less overwhelming and easier to interact with. And so, and then, like you said, you can always give more, right? Um, I also think that there is a lot of benefit to your child and their eating patterns and habits. Like breakfast in my house is usually the quote unquote best eaten meal, right? We wake up with an appetite, we're excited to eat. Okay, dinner time is a completely different story. By the end of the day, we are just done. We're overstimulated. We're tired. We don't want to figure out a new food, right? Like dinner is what I would call the quote unquote harder meal of the day. So I don't put a whole lot of expectation there. And that's why I also start with much smaller portions there. Whereas at breakfast, you might see slightly larger portions because I know that for my child, that's a time for us to capitalize on. So I think there's also so much individualization in from one kid to the next or one family to the next that to just say X amount of food is what every toddler should be eating is just not appropriate.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We're definitely in the breakfast is the favorite meal of the
Hmm.
day in my household too. So I'm like, if she eats a good breakfast, the rest of the day we'll just see how she does, right?
Yeah, well, and that's
Um,
also why like I'm strategic about, if I know that breakfast is a good meal of the day, like there's going to be vegetables in breakfast. Like I'm not waiting till dinner to see if you eat a vegetable today. Like you can make it work for
that's
you,
a
make
good,
it work in your
yeah,
favor.
yeah, that's a good idea. That's one of my questions later. So, there's a lot of initiative to, make America healthier, right? With
Mm.
like artificial dyes and additives and seed oils. So what is your philosophy, I guess, on all of that, in terms of ingredients? Because I've seen you post some like, some snacks before and people are like, how dare you? Like that's processed and whatever.
Mm.
And like I'm the whole like every food fits in some capacity. So how do you hold those boundaries also with like your son and snacks and all of that, all of that stuff?
Yeah. Um, so I think for me, this always comes back to the bigger picture. Because demonizing certain ingredients does not give you overall or sustainable health, right? So I do believe that all foods can fit in moderation. There is also an age appropriateness to that, right? So even like we were talking about with added sugar, there is an age appropriateness to that. But that doesn't mean that sugar itself is inherently bad, right? So we don't have to be so extremist with certain foods or ingredients. Now, with things like seed oils or, a lot of these things that are just like big, like nutrition hype words, essentially is what I call them. Like, again, finding where that is meant to fit in the diet. So, I do buy snacks that have seed oils in them. Does my child eat them every single day? Nope. Do we have them in the house every week? No. But are they there sometimes? Yes. So there's like this level of neutralizing and finding moderation that is so important. And similar to the added sugar concept, like I'm most often cooking whole foods with just real and simple ingredients to where like when I use a bagged French fry on occasion, or we go out to eat and I know they're not cooking with what I would probably cook with at home, I'm not worried about that. So I think there's a lot of fear mongering around food happening right now. When personally, I would put the focus more on what are you doing than what you shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, like what are you doing majority of the time, right?
Yes.
Because what you do for one-offs doesn't matter when like the
Right.
majority of your diet is focused on like non-processed whole foods and things like that because you want your
Right.
kids to develop a healthy relationship with all of it,
Yeah.
right?
Because also like withholding or restricting any certain food group because of what you believe about it doesn't set your child up to know how to handle that food later in life, which could essentially set them up to like overeat those things, not know how to fit them into a balanced diet, right? So we don't want to be like restriction is not always the answer either.
Yeah. When should parents be concerned that something might be wrong outside of like normal toddler eating behavior?
Mm. So every child is so uniquely different, honestly, that concern can look different in different situations. And this answer could change from one situation to the next. So I always tell parents if you feel concerned, that's enough to start asking questions, especially in the first 2 years, because there's still so much that we can do to help your little one become more adventurous with food at this point. So if you're like even slightly worried or stressed about feeding your little one, it's worth it to look for clarity because also if you're worried or stressed, your child is going to feed off of that worry and stress, no matter how hidden you think it is. So I think that's such an individualized question, honestly. But I think like it's worth exploring if you're worried about your individual child.
And who is the best professional to seek out? Like a feeding therapist? Like something like that exists, right?
Yes, so there are feeding therapists, and that can be very beneficial, depending on what the issue is. So for little ones with like oral development issues or aversions, things like that, feeding therapy can be extremely helpful. I've also had parents who have gone through feeding therapy with their little ones seen some progress, but then after graduating from feeding therapy, still struggling, and going through my coaching program where we really address a lot of the like root issues and habits and routines and schedules that are happening at home, so that change can actually be made in the home too, and with how parents are interacting with food, because I think something that we dismiss so often is how they're being influenced by so many different things, in particular us, right? So it's not always something that's just like, oh, my toddler stopped eating vegetables, he needs feeding therapy. Sometimes there's more like easier practical changes that can be made that aren't necessarily we have a texture aversion or an actual like skill problem, right?
Mm-hmm. What are some things that parents can do that work full time? I know you've talked about eating with your children and how important
Mm-hmm.
that is, but most parents both work and they can't eat every meal together. So how do they balance
Totally.
that?
Totally. So it does not have to be every single meal. But as often as you can eat with your child, there is benefit to that. So doing that in a realistic way that works for you, even if that's 2 or 3 nights a week that we sit down and have family dinner, that is better than none, right? Or if it's, hey, we get to eat breakfast together, but then dinner just doesn't work out that way. Wherever you can make it work for you. I mean, I also think that that's just something, I mean, we know this as moms, like you have to prioritize things, right? If family meal times is something that's important to you, you can find a way. Even if you're working full time doing 1,000 other things, we're all doing 1,000 things, right? So whether it's a breakfast, a lunch, a snack, a dinner, like I don't care what meal of the day it is, having that time of connection with your child around food is not just important for their relationship with food, but it's a time of connection and bonding. And I mean, research supports family meals in so many different aspects of child development. Um, that yeah, it's not always something that just like happens easily. I do think we have to make it a priority,
Yeah, absolutely. So we've
especially in
talked,
like our culture today of like eating on
yes,
the
how,
go and
yes, fat, yeah, eating in the car, things like
yeah.
that.
Which
Yeah.
don't get me wrong, there's a place
Like,
for that. Like that happens to me too. We do it too,
right.
right? But again, going back to the like, what are you doing most of the time?
Right. Right. So what if you don't start early? Like what if someone found your page and they have like a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old and they're
Mhm.
struggling with all of this stuff? Like is it too late for them? Can behavior be changed? And how do parents navigate that?
It's never too late. I am a firm believer in that. Um, it's never too late for your child. It's never too late for you. And even though the first 2 years of life are super nutritionally important, and that's why I pour my heart and soul into them, nutrition throughout the lifespan is important. And so, yeah, seeking help even with an older child, like I do not ever believe that someone is too old um, to see change. And I do have a lot of colleagues and other dietitians who work in the pediatric space, specifically picky eating with older kiddos that like when I get inquiries for older kiddos that I refer to. So there are tons of dietitians who do very similar things to me, but specialize in an older population who are great at what they do and really serve parents and kids well. So it's always worth looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you said earlier is like our kids model what we do. So I feel
Hmm.
like as a parent, like what it's such a great time for you to really look at your diet, right? And like look at what you're eating and like
Totally.
is that how you want do you want that modeled like for your child because
Hmm.
that's what's going to happen, right? So I think that
For
we have
sure.
to really like look in the mirror and really be honest with ourselves and how we're eating.
Yeah, how we're eating, how we're treating our body, how we talk to ourselves. I mean, it all goes together.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a little bit of Q&A now from my Instagram, I put out that I was interviewing you on this podcast. So a couple of
Yeah.
those questions to wrap us up. So first question, how the heck do you get toddlers to eat more vegetables?
So going back to that repeated exposure thing, repeated exposure again and again and again. So like my motto is like, again, going back to family meal, like if a vegetable is part of the family meal, it should also be on your child's plate. Because if it's not on your child's plate, it's probably because you think they're not going to eat it, right? And that
Hmm.
is a mindset of your own that we need to work through. Um, you definitely can, though, like if you're thinking nutritionally, right? Like adding vegetables into things, mixing them into pasta sauce or into muffins or pancakes. Like those are definitely all things that I do too. My biggest thing with that, though, is if your child is old enough to ask you what that is or what's in that, that we need to be upfront with them. Because sneaking things or hiding things or trying to like pull the wool over their eyes does not build food trust. And it's actually gonna work against you in the long run. So like the whole like I'm sneaking vegetables in concept is not really something I get behind. Um, there are other ways to help them take interest in them. I mean, you can use dips, you can use fun food picks, you can use a fun utensil. So there's lots of different ways to get creative with sparking engagement. But consistency is really what's going to pay off in the long run. And the other thing to know nutritionally is fruits and vegetables do have very similar nutrients in them. So like if your child's eating a bunch of fruits and not eating any vegetables, they are getting a lot of vitamins and minerals from those fruits, right? So it's not that we want to stop serving vegetables or that we don't want to think about them, right? Like we still want them to eventually come to accept them. But you don't have to feel so defeated by it.
Yeah. Okay. All right, next question. My daughter won't stop throwing food on the floor or trying to feed the dog. How can I get her to stop this behavior?
So food throwing is a fun season.
Ugh.
So first of all, telling her what to do, instead of what not to do. So
Okay.
instead of don't throw that, giving her a different instruction. So essentially, our food belongs on our plate. It doesn't belong on the floor. Telling her what you want her to do instead of don't throw the dog, don't throw food, or don't feed the dog,
Yeah.
don't throw food, right? The other thing, depending on age, um, is like if your child isn't like talking to you yet, like to start baby sign language, or use baby sign language to get a better indicator of what they're trying to tell you by food throwing. Sometimes throwing food is just, I'm being a baby or a toddler and I'm throwing food. Sometimes it's an indicator of I'm over this, I'm done, I'm not hungry anymore, or I want more of something else that's no longer on my plate, right? So strengthening communication with your baby or your toddler can be helpful too.
Awesome. How can you navigate setting boundaries with family? My mom always wants to give my kiddos sweet treats. I want them to have a
Mm,
healthy relationship with sugar and treats, but also not to overdo it.
yeah, totally. So this is hard, but asking for respect of how you choose to handle sweets in your home for sure. And again, giving them something that they can do instead of something that they can't. Like especially for a grandparent, if that's a sweet thing that they get to do with their grandchild, right? We don't want to take that from them. But giving them something that they can do instead. So maybe like I love that you want to have fun with food with my kids, but I really care about their sugar intake and I'm being intentional about it. Could we compromise and say that like maybe once a week you get to take them to get ice cream, but on the other days we do these snack choices? Something along those lines.
Okay. how to get my toddler to feed herself and actually eat. She'll sit at the table and just wiggle around, but never eat. We try limiting snacks and waiting for her to do it herself, but nothing seems to make a difference.
Hmm. This is a multifactorial question.
Yeah.
Honestly, there's not one answer that I can just put on that. Where I would start is with the division of responsibility, assessing your mealtime environment, looking at food language, looking at what's going on the plate, how it's going on the plate. I mean, there's so many different things here
Hmm.
um, to
Apply to
to
Kathy's
be
program.
addressed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Apply. We'll talk about that at the end, but
Yeah.
yeah. How to introduce new foods to a picky eater who is stubborn and flat out refuses to eat if he doesn't like what's offered.
Oh, okay. So again, lots of factors that go on here. And honestly, that's why I work with clients for 12 weeks because oftentimes it's not a matter of like one simple tip or trick that's like gonna solve this problem, right? It's gonna be multifactorial, like weeks of uncovering what's actually going on in the schedule, in the routine, appetite, milk intake. I mean, there's so many things there again.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a good thing, and then it's also like it's both things, right? It's like,
Yeah.
but it's great that there's resources out there like yourself that can help parents with this. Like I was telling Kathy before is if I was having issues with whatever, like I would seek help because
Yeah.
I think that nutrition, like for me, it's like it's one of your if it's like it's one of my values, right? Like
Hmm.
health is like one of my values, right? So that's really important to me. So if she was struggling extensively, I would definitely want to seek help. So that is something that Kathy offers. The
Yeah.
last question, and this is probably one with a lot of responses as well, but we'll see. How to encourage new foods without a tantrum.
Okay. So yes, lots of things going on here as well, depending on what that tantrum is related to, what else has happened in the day. But and something that I could tack on to the last question as well is like similar to introducing new foods. Well, just introducing new foods in general, whether you're dealing with a tantrum or someone who's stubborn.
Mm-hmm.
But serving them alongside preferred foods. So like using those preferred foods to your advantage, but again, not pressuring them to eat it. So remembering that like the new exposure to a food is like the purpose of that exposure is exposure, not for them to eat it. Because there's so many steps in your little one's mind and body that have to be completed before they ever decide to actually eat a food. So sometimes that food just needs to be there repeatedly in a way that feels approachable for them to eventually come to interact with it, and then eventually eat it, right? So sometimes we just want to put a food on their plate and just see them go at it right then. And if they don't, then we think they don't like it. But really, we haven't given it a full shot.
Yeah, absolutely. Like for me, my daughter is not good at eating vegetables. Like I will just flat out
Mm-hmm.
say it. There are certain vegetables that are always a win, like tomatoes, green beans, um, peas, like so, some of the carrots. But then some of them, it's just like comical. I'm like, I know she's like in my head. I'm always like, she's not
Mm-hmm.
gonna eat this. She's not. When she touches the food and like puts it in her mouth, even if she doesn't eat it, I'm like, it's a win for me, right?
That is a win.
Like, yeah, like I don't care if she doesn't eat it, but like she touches it, puts it in her mouth, and then puts it back down, and then I just don't say anything, right?
Yeah.
I just don't give the food power over
Yes.
the situation.
Yes, I
But
love, oh my gosh, I love how you just said that. I don't give the
yeah,
food the power because so often when I'm having conversations with parents, like we make it about the food. And I'm like, it's not, the food's not the problem. Like nine
yeah,
times out of 10, it's not the food, especially when somebody's like, oh, maybe I'm just not a good enough cook or I need different, more baby or toddler friendly recipes so that they can eat that. I'm like, no, it's not the food. It's everything
Yeah.
else.
Yeah, yeah. And it's funny because so last Friday I made homemade pizza and I had tons of
Uh-huh.
vegetables on it. It was like peppers and mushrooms, and she gobbled it all up, but it was served different. Like everything was kind of
Yeah,
chopped up tiny. So I think that's probably another thing too, is just like changing the way you offer it. Like so
totally.
like it's not like the same, mushroom every time or peppers. Like now that she
Totally.
has a full mouth of teeth, like I know she could try raw pepper and like raw
Yeah.
apple and raw carrot and stuff like that.
I mean,
So,
it's similar to us too. Like, think about like we get bored of the same food, of the same presentation of a food all the time, right? So, same for them.
yeah, yeah,
Sometimes just
absolutely.
mixing it up a little bit helps.
Yeah. So what is your so before we go, I'll have you give your, where people can find you, but before that, what is the biggest advice you could give parents who are in this age range, right? Like that 0 to 2 phase of parenting.
Yeah. Don't give up. Um, really don't give up. And seek help if you feel lost or overwhelmed or stressed out. Because you're not failing and it's not really anything that anyone prepares you for. Like nobody prepares you for what it is to feed a baby or a toddler. So there's no shame in needing help or guidance. But really, the best thing that you can do is be consistent. Take a look inward at what your own relationship with food is, what your own dietary habits are, because your little ones, even though it feels weird to say, like your baby is picking up on those and mimicking those and is using you as an example. So, um, yeah, don't
Absolutely.
don't stop. Don't
Yeah.
give up.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you feel like you found Kathy too late in life, still reach out to her, and there's obviously resources for you. If you have an older kiddo that's like 3 or 4 or 5 and really struggling, there's people out there that help. But if you're in
Totally.
that 0 to 2 age range, Kathy is your girl. So where can people find you?
You can find me on Instagram at the Mini Me Dietitian. I have lots of resources linked in my bio on my Instagram. So free resources, also the application to my coaching program if you feel that's something you're interested in. My DMs are always open. So that's the best place to find me for
Awesome.
now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the work that you do, and thank you for helping parents. And everybody, thank you for listening to this episode. I'll link Kathy's information in the show notes so that you can connect with her. Until next time, see you next time, guys.